made a mistake. So Jodie, thank you very much for coming. I'll stop my share and put you back on now. Thank you.
Sure, no worries. Cool. Okay, so sorry, I'll just get this going. Awesome. Yeah, so I do like to kind of try and make the session a little bit interactive, which you know, is probably more challenging than if we were able to be in a room together. So I am going to be talking today about developing culturally responsive, or we could say culturally sustaining mathematical tasks in your classroom. And so I do just start to talk about some of the work that we've been doing. So we work in around probably coming up to 200, next year will be about 250 schools around New Zealand. And our focus is really working with diverse students and looking at how we can support teachers to change the classrooms, change our pedagogy and our practices so that we better meet the needs of all the learners in our classroom. And why this particular area that I'll be talking about today I think is really important is because some of the research we do involves speaking to children and interviewing them about where they see in their mathematics, where they see themselves in their mathematics classrooms. And what we often find is that there's a lot of children who don't see their own lives, their community, you know, reflected in the tasks that are used in the mathematics classroom. And so what that means is for these children, when we ask them how they feel being whatever ethnicity they identify with in the classroom, they often talk about their own ethnicity or, you know, cultural grouping as having no mathematics. So, for example, we've had children who come from Tokelau, and when we've said, how do you feel being Tokelauan in the classroom, they'll say, well, it's weird because Tokelauans don't do maths. Or, you know, we've had other children from Samoa who talk about how they have to become a palangi to do maths, and then after the maths lesson's finished, they can go back to being Samoan again. Okay. And I mean, for myself as a Cook Island New Zealander, and I think really for most teachers, that's pretty concerning to think that our children in this country don't see that their culture is reflected in the maths classroom, and also seeing their culture as having no mathematics, when I think it's pretty apparent that all cultures have mathematics. So part of the work that we do is focused on how we can start drawing on the rich mathematics that children have in their home backgrounds and in the community to think about what is the authentic maths that exists in those contexts and how we can draw on that in our classrooms. There's other things we can do as well. We can look at the children's values. We can look at, you know, other parts of their cultural identity and think about how we can shape our pedagogy in a way that aligns with you know, children from different cultural backgrounds and different with different value systems. But another thing that we can do is also think about, okay, where is maths in the children in my class, where is the mathematics in their lives outside of school? Because I think some of the time people think that we can address this by using school contexts, but the children don't recognise school really as their life. I mean, it's just somewhere they go for part of the day. It's not genuinely who they are and what they view as their life. So how do we go beyond that? Okay, so how do we go beyond using school-based context? Sometimes people think that they can meet this by using a kind of generic context, but I think this doesn't address it far enough. You know, so when I talk about generic contexts, I'm talking about things like going shopping or celebrations and things like that. Again, I think that's not really authentically getting into it. Actually, a teacher the other day, I was just reading an interview from one of our teachers who's in one of the research projects, and she had said that she would see problems written about Hemi, for example, and Hemi goes to the shop or Hemi does that, and she's Samoan background, and she said she'd look at that and she'd think Hemi doesn't do that. So this is about getting past that, you know. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about why it's important to have culturally sustaining, culturally responsive. I like to put both of those terms together because I think we need to probably at this point push past just thinking about cultural responsiveness, but also to be talking about what culturally sustaining means. And when I talk about culturally sustaining, what I'm talking about is that a child can maintain their cultural identity in the mathematics classroom and bring their culture with them as an asset or as a strength. Okay, so if we're thinking about culturally responsive or sustaining teaching, and we're thinking about tasks that we can develop in our classroom, we can use these to address heritage. So what I mean by that, and I'm going to show you some examples, is in terms of heritage, I'm really talking about the history of people. Okay, and so and this is really what I'll be talking about today. I've focused the types of tasks, which I'm going to show you examples and get you to think about them. I've focused those around our Pacific students because that's the area of work that I'm working closely in, and that's you know, the students that we are working with. But when I talk about this, it actually goes right across other groups of students, and I can give you some examples of that. But when we're talking about heritage, what I'm talking about here is that as a Pacifica person, I can say that I come from a history of mathematicians. So our people, you know, years ago navigated around the waters, around the seas, and that has a huge element of mathematics in it. So that's something as a Pacific person I can be proud of, that my heritage includes mathematics. We have cultural artifacts which include mathematics, and that's part of our history. So if we're thinking about this in our mathematics lessons, we could start addressing the heritage of our students and thinking about what is the mathematics in the past that we've brought forward into present day that we can be proud of as a group of people. We could also think about the personal perceptions. So what I mean by that is when you've got children who are saying, I'm from Tokelau and it's weird to be in the mathematics classroom because Tokelauans don't do maths. That's a personal perception. If we've got children who, and that's when I talk about those kind of statements, I use them as examples because it's not one child who says that. These are big groups of children saying that. So when we interview it, I think that we would probably get at least a third of the children who say very deficit comments about their own culture or the lack of mathematics in their culture. So that would be about a third. A third of the kids would say things about how it doesn't really matter because there's this idea that mathematics is cultureless and your culture has nothing to do with what you do in maths. And again, I think that's concerning because I think, of course, your culture comes into every aspect of what you do. And probably, and this is, I'm talking about in schools where we're just working with in the first year, and then about a third of the kids would say things like, I feel normal in the maths classroom. Well, we want everybody to be feeling normal, and we want everybody to be seeing their culture as a strength to bring into the mathematics lessons. You know, something that actually supports them, something that gives them, I guess, a head start in solving maths problems, you know, being proud that they come from a culture that has strong mathematics in it. So your culturally responsive teaching using tasks which draw on children's cultural heritage also can address their experiences. Okay, because it can offer them a view of what mathematics can be and what mathematics should be. So by that I mean, if they've come from a classroom or come from teaching where they never see themselves reflected, what we can do as a teacher, we can change that. We can show them that in fact, your culture is mathematical and your experiences do draw on mathematics. Okay, and then I guess your last part is your societal norms, because I think there is a lot of, I hear teachers all the time talking about how in New Zealand, there's a lot of the time people think there's nothing wrong at saying that you can't do maths or you're bad at maths or things like that. So I think we can use this to start addressing that, to say actually we can, all of us can be good at mathematics. All of us have something to offer to the mathematics classroom. So we can start addressing, using these types of tasks to start addressing that norm that it's okay to not be able to do mathematics, to actually say everybody can do mathematics and everybody should be able to do mathematics. So what we need to be doing as teachers is thinking about how we can bridge these gaps which are sustained by the status quo. If we keep doing what we've always done in our mathematics classrooms, we're never going to get the changes that we need. And if you look at the results of New Zealand in international studies, I think that there's probably limited value in comparing ourselves to other countries. But what the important thing is, we need to look at how different groups of students in our own country are doing. And that is where I think we need to focus our attention, is how do we ensure that we are serving all of the students who are in our classrooms. So we need to be thinking about how we bridge the gaps which are sustained by the status quo, but we also have to empower students to bridge the gaps themselves. Because as a teacher, there's only so much you can do. We've got to think about how can we get the students to be bridging the gaps as well. And so I hope you can walk away from this session today with some ideas about how to do this and how you can take this back to your classroom. So when we're thinking about the task design that we can use in our classroom, and we're thinking about tasks which draw on the cultural background of the students, and when I talk about cultural background, I'm taking a quite a broad view of what I'm talking about here. So it doesn't have to be ethnicity, it can also be your local curriculum. So when you think about culture, you can think about the culture of the neighborhood that you live in. You can think about the popular culture, which is often related to the area that you live in or the interests of your students. So all of those draw, when we're talking about culture, we're thinking about all of those things. So I think it is important, yes, to draw on the ethnicity of the students and their experiences, but you also need to be thinking about your local area and what is the culture of the local area that the students live in. What is a popular culture? You know, how is math seen in popular culture, and how can you build on that in terms of the tasks that you're designing? Okay, and if we do that, if we start using tasks which are drawing on the cultural background, and I mean authentically drawing on the cultural background, we can start supporting the students to make mathematical connections to their home culture. Okay, so that's one outcome. We can start getting kids to talk about what mathematics is in their home culture. We can also start supporting closer community involvement. Okay, so we can see parents as valuable partners in our schools and in our communities, and that means that we can show parents that we value them, but we can also use them as support in our maths classroom. Okay, so see parents' support as an asset. And the other part is empowerment. Okay, so I think a lot of what I'm talking about here is about empowering students. Okay, and I've got some tasks at the end which are focused on social justice and mathematics, and that's another way of empowering, is actually getting children to critically look at data from New Zealand and think about, why is it that way? What can we do to change it? Okay, sometimes these are really uncomfortable conversations, I think, for us as teachers as well, but I think we have to be brave enough to take the risk to allow our students to look at real life data, real life situations, and explore these and think about them and critique them. Okay, so what I just wanted to do first is to show you, this is actually a personal example, you can see in the photos here, and I am going to ask people to perhaps volunteer some ideas here. So I've developed my slides around those kind of three areas that I was talking about. So this one here is about addressing heritage. And why I say this is a personal for me, because the photo there that you can see is my family at my grandmother's 90th birthday. And my grandmother is Cook Islander, and she makes te vai, which are the Cook Island quilts that you can see in the background. So I've got a couple of different pictures there, and you can see them hanging in the background. That's my mother and one of my uncles and all my mother's siblings in the photo there for my grandmother's birthday. And the te vai-vais which are hanging up in the background are all te vai-vais which my grandmother has made. I've also got just another example there of a te vai-vai one of my aunties made me, and a cushion there as well. So when we talk about these Cook Island quilts, I think it's also important that we contextualize how they're made and what they're made for, because I think if we're going to use something like this in the classroom, we can't just use it as a random object, but we have to tell the story about why it's important, how it is made, and all of those things to get the children really to value it in its context, rather than just using it as a tool to teach mathematics. So when we talk about these Cook Island quilts, te vai-vai, they're made by groups of women. They're a really special piece of artwork, I'd say, because they are made in a group, and the patterns are handed down through families. So you have somebody who kind of holds the patterns in their head and designs the te vai-vai. They're made generally as one piece layered over another piece. So they're all cut out, as you can kind of see in the back pictures. There's a couple of different types that you can see there, but mostly they're made from one piece of fabric being cut as a whole, and then hand sewn with tiny stitches onto a backing piece of fabric. The other way that they can be made, as you can see in the little photo down on the, I'm not sure which way it will go for you, but I'm thinking it's bottom right, is that they're tiny little squares which are sewn together. Okay, all of these are hand sewn. So you can imagine that there's a tremendous amount of love that goes into making these and a tremendous amount of time. Okay, but when I look at these with my mathematics hat on, I can also see a whole lot of mathematics in it. And that's what I want you to have a look at and think about. Okay, and I'm going to ask people to unmute, and I hope that some people will be brave enough to volunteer some ideas about where you can see mathematics in these te vaivais, and then I'm going to share a couple of examples of tasks that we've designed to get children to have a look at. So I'll just have a look. Is anybody?
I can see rotational symmetry.
Cool. So rotational symmetry, can you talk a little bit more about that?
The picture with the sort of leaves on it, is it? The second one, the bigger picture of one cushion. It might not absolutely be perfect rotational symmetry, but you could rotate that image around itself. And you could see lines of symmetry in that. Or you could talk to students about whether they can see that. I mean, then you look at the berries and that might actually not translate to a rotational symmetry thing, but you could talk about whether it's reflected or, yeah, that sort of thing. So I see the geometry in that one.
Cool. And so why do you think geometry is being used in that? Like for what purpose? If that makes sense. Because I think this is important to talk to the kids about as well. Because, you know, I think when we make a te vaivai like this, I totally agree with you. Geometry is being used. Yeah.
Probably the patterning and the impact that it has and the repetition and the layout and just, yeah, the impact that it has. And I mean, I don't have the cultural connection there, but that's something that you could draw out from the students.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. But I think I really like what you're saying there, because this is what I like to get across to the kids, is that we're not looking at this just as, you know, taking it away from the context and thinking this is just mathematics, but we need to go back and say that, you know, geometrical kind of aspects are present in here because it is a beautiful piece of artwork. It's part of what makes it beautiful. So part of, you know, having this kind of creation is using these things to develop that impact. Yeah. So yeah, so I think that's a great example. Okay, and I think there's a lot of other geometrical concepts that you can see when you look at these. I'm wondering if people can see any other kind of
I can see some ratios there in the bottom left quilt. You know, how many of this colour to how many of that colour, and you know, if I'm going to repeat that same pattern several times on the quilt, how many, you know, building those ratios up. And even more than two colours, you know, multiple ratio relationships there.
Yep. And I think again that what you're talking about is really important, and that's purposeful. Yeah, and that's what we need to get across to the kids, is this isn't random. These, you know, when people design te vaivai like this, it is purposeful to use things like ratio, because again, it's to make it really look attractive to us. You know, so those are purposeful things. They're not kind of random things which are used in these kinds of, you know, artifacts. Yeah. Anybody else?
I was interested in the proportions on the one behind your uncle, whoever's speaking there. Just looking at the balance of the backing colour versus the front colour, and thinking if you were to say, oh, there's too much yellow there, that would have to scale down the flower pattern. So getting the idea of the, I guess the proportion of those two colours, and then saying, oh, how would we scale down those patterns and still get everything coherent?
Yeah, sure. And I really like that idea that you're talking about there too, because I think that that fits really nicely into a purposeful. So, you know, you could be using the thing with this design. If they wanted to have more of the backing color coming through rather than the yellow, then you could use it as a you know, purposeful, that you'd need to scale the color down to think about that. So cool. Anything else before we just have a look at the next task that we've got?
I think it could link to other areas as well, like why have they used yellow? Does it have a cultural significance, or, you know, that sort of thing as well? So like, you know, it lends to different things and what the colours might mean in certain cultures or certain religions and things like that. So they can link to that purpose. Like someone hasn't just randomly picked yellow. There's a purpose and a reasoning behind it. So yeah, just it also links to other areas.
Yeah, and I think that's, I was looking in the chat as people are talking about that as well. So I think, yeah, those are really important things when we look at these, is to keep that kind of authenticity and think about what kind of patterns and motifs are being used and for what purpose. You know, so I think Te Vaiwai, for example, is often based on nature. So you can see there's a lot of patterns of flowers in there. Other people have talked about symbols of religion because of the value of spirituality in Cook Island culture. But you can see a lot of the time that we've got motifs which are repeated because they are representing what we do see in nature, in the garden, those kinds of things, and their representation of that. And again, yep, you've got your ideas about colours and what kind of colours you use and why, and all of those kinds of things as well. Yeah. So one of the things I can see, and somebody's talked about, yeah, measurement. I can see people talking about measurement coming through, and absolutely there's a lot of measurement concepts that you need to be able to create a Te Vaiwai and to design Te Vaiwai. So, and because these are bedspreads as well, I should say, you know, yeah, you do use a Te Vaiwai as a bedspread, but you also would use it for unveilings. So when somebody's passed away, you may use a Te Vaiwai, put it over the headstone for the unveiling. And of course, you know, you may have a single Te Vaiwai, or you may have a double or a queen one for a bedspread. Somebody else has said algebra patterns, and that's that is actually one of the eyes that I take to it, because I do a lot of work in algebra, and particularly, so I'll show you actually the task in a second. You can see this task, the green one here, the green cushion cover. So that's one that caught my eye, to think about how we could see that as a growing pattern, and to think about if you wanted to use the same kind of pattern and change that from a cushion cover up into a bedspread, how could you do that? So I'll just show you an example of a task that we had designed based on the cushion. And it was interesting because somebody talked before about the pink, and I don't quite know what they meant to be representing. I should ask my grandmother, but anyway, so the pink dots on the cushion cover, and I think that it's okay to take, we actually took them off in the end because we didn't want to kind of distract the kids from it. So I'll just show you this task. I hope you can see it because of the so I'll just give you a minute. Yeah, and I love the chat that's going on in the rooms about fractals and things like that too. So you can see a heap of stuff here. It's great. This is just an example of a task that we designed thinking about Te Vaiwai design. And I haven't actually got the full story that we used because we didn't write it straight onto the problem, but we used the context that there was a group of mamas working on this Te Vaiwai design, and the little story that we developed behind it was what I said before, that this group of mamas were working on a Te Vaiwai design, and yep, and the story behind it was that they wanted to use the cushion cover design, and they wanted to extend it further to make it into a quilt cover and keep the pattern growing in the same way. So what we're asking the children, we're talking about the leaves, and we saw the leaves as the 4 leaves in the middle and then the leaves growing around the outside, if you can see that. So I can see Jackie's talking about doing it as a staff and having lots of arguments about what constitutes a leaf. So I think that's really important when you're launching the tasks, to really clarify with the children what you're talking about there. So I am quite specific in talking about the 4 in the middle. So you've got the, and I hope you can kind of see it. It is difficult in here because I'm kind of pointing at my computer, and I know that you can't actually see me pointing at my computer, so that's not very much help. But on the first position, for example, yeah, we wrote that lesson, Robin. So we used this one and wrote a lesson for the home learning TV over the lockdown period. So there's also another lesson that you could watch on the just trying to think what education counts. So I've actually used this task right across different curriculum levels. So it's another example too that I'd like to talk about, because I think, you've got the 4 in the middle and the 8 around the edge, and then the next one's got the 4 in the middle, and then you could see it as 2 and 2, 2 and 2, 2 and 2, 2 and 2, or 8. Sometimes children see it as the 2 on each arm, like this, and so on like that. But the problem itself, I think, is a really good example of a low floor, what we could call a low floor, high ceiling task as well, because it has a easy entry point for a lot of children, but it also has multiple exit points in terms of generalizing the pattern and thinking about how, you know, what the pattern would be for the 76 position, for example, and going up to the growing pattern rule. Okay, so that's one example there. Just keeping an eye on the time. Cool. Okay, so I'm just going to show you another example which draws on measurement here. Okay, so this is actually thinking about the te vaivai where you sew squares together. So there are different names for te vaivai, and this is the type of te vaivai where it's made by actually sewing the squares together rather than having it as one piece. Okay, and thinking about your measurement concepts about your area and what lengths the border would be or could be, depending on this as well. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to give you a minute to look at that, and I'm just going to move on because I am aware of the time as well, and I don't want to run out of time. But if there's any questions, feel free to jump in and ask, or if you're more comfortable putting it into the chat, that's fine as well. Okay, the other one I think which has a lot of mathematics in it when you're thinking about Pacific culture is your Tapa, or we could call it Siapo or Masi. So all of these different names are all the same name for this type of decorated bark cloth. Okay, and it's kind of I think it's an interesting cultural there's an interesting cultural part here, because in the Cook Islands, we don't really have tapa cloth in the Cook Islands, but one of the reasons that we don't have the tapa cloth is because missionaries introduced the te vaivai in quilt making, and so that overtook. We did previously, you know, pre-colonization, have tapa cloth as well, but in the Cook Islands, te vaivai became the kind of heritage item, I suppose, instead of tapa. But if we're thinking about tapa and what's the importance of it and what its setting and use is, because I do think that this is important when we use tasks. I can't reiterate this more, you know, I think that we're not doing a service if we just take somebody's culture and turn it into a maths problem without placing it where it sits in the culture and thinking about its importance and contextualizing it to our students. It doesn't have to be you who does it. I mean, one of the teachers, one of you said that, I think, you know, you can think about this is also about giving your children an opportunity to talk about their culture and their experiences with it as well, and giving them status in that way. But for your tapa and your bark cloth, it's used in everyday settings, so it might be a mat, okay, or it could be a room divider in home, hanging room divider. It also has really important ceremonial uses during weddings or funerals. Okay, and at times you might see, like the little child in the picture there, that you may wear a piece of tapa as well on a different occasions. So I just want people to have a look here again, and what can you see in terms of the mathematics in these pictures? So I'd like people to share some ideas about what you can see. Anybody?
Rotational symmetry here again, and the way it's shaded gives it a little bit of depth. It has a 3D effect the way it is shaded, and sometimes when we shade some surfaces on cubes in the classroom to give it that 3D effect, that could be related to here.
Yep, so you've got the rotation, you've got the shading for the 3D effect as well. Yep, I can see people talking about enlargement and circumference, fractions and angles. Anybody else want to share? Yep, tessellation. You've got repeating patterns in the one on the left. you know, you've got some repeating patterns which you can see as well. But I think, you know, you can look at this again and think about, yeah, right-angled triangles. Yeah. Now the triangles are interesting. So I found out something that I didn't actually know. The motif of the triangles for Samoan culture is that they're representing shark teeth as well. So I think that's that was something new for me that I only found out in the past 2 weeks. Again, so I think that's also important to think about, what are these representing? You know, what are the motifs representing? What are the symbols representing? And to infuse that into your mathematics lesson as well. Okay. So I've just got a couple of examples here as well. Sorry, just go here. Okay, so this is one thinking about the geometry, the geometrical properties that you can see in Tapa. And we talk about this as addressing heritage as well, because this is actually a piece of Tapa cloth which is displayed at a museum in Oregon. And so you do see Tapa cloth in museums all around the world, which are displayed as, you know, artifacts of historical importance, but also as artwork as well. So what we were thinking about here is, how can you develop geometry and geometrical descriptions of the cloth so that somebody could reproduce it? Okay, and I think there that you can see there's a lot of geometrical concepts in this one piece here. Okay, but it's also trying to think about, you know, contextualizing what we're doing rather than just seeing, here's a piece of Tapa, what's all the geometry you can see, you know, trying to think of some kind of context where we can think about this, and at the same time maintain the importance of it. Okay, so what I'd just like you to do now is have a think, reflect about, what are the cultural artifacts? Now actually just thinking about the Tapa cloth, and where I said we want to make connections not just to our Pacific children, but other children who might have cultural contexts or artifacts that come from their own culture which are similar to these. So there's a space in your mathematics lessons to connect this to the wider community as well. And I had a really nice example of a teacher who wrote to one of our mentors just last week and said that she had developed a lesson where she was looking at Siapo, and one of her children, I think, who had come from Syria and as a refugee in New Zealand, had got very excited when he saw this, because he said that they have a similar kind of piece of parchment in their culture, which is part of his heritage, which was used, you know, has been used hundreds of years ago, and that they have kind of secret codes on this, so that it's a piece of artwork, but they also used it as messages and secret codes and kind of things like that on it. So yeah, so I can see that sari fabric. And yeah, I think actually similar, I went to India at the beginning of last year and was quite surprised to see the similar kind of artwork and things in the heritage villages that we went to, and we saw displayed as well. So it's not just about the one kind of culture, but it's also about connecting this to the children and thinking about, what do you have in your culture that's similar to this? But I'd just like you to have a think. Yeah, cool. So I can see people talking about mandala, tuku panels, rangoli patterns, and think about the really important part here is to think about, how are these mathematical? And how can we use them to develop a problem building on the context of them? Okay, so if we were in a room together, I'd get you to talk together and have a chat about that. But I think given the time and given the difficulties of having a chat about it, that's probably a good thing for you to think about, to go away and to have a think about what, if you can think of the cultures that your kids come from, what would be some of the artifacts where you could make a connection to their heritage? How can you think about these as mathematical? Okay, if you're stuck, if you don't know much about them, yeah, lanterns I think is another one. If you're stuck and if you don't know much about a culture, there's a lot of resources. So like I just mentioned before, we were we wrote a lot of the scripts for the home learning television channel, and we were trying to focus on Pacific students and aligning, you know, with Pacific contexts. And I know Cook Island culture, but I can't say I know every Pacific culture. So one of the resources which was really helpful was the CocoNet, and is that website you can go and look behind, you know, what is behind, so that you're not kind of appropriating, but you're actually going and finding out and learning about the significance of this and what is the cultural context behind it. Okay, so now let's have just a look at your addressing your everyday experiences. Okay, so I think for many of our Pacific community, an everyday experience that the children have and an everyday experience that children receive is making ula e, which is your necklaces or your garlands. Okay, and sometimes these are made just from flowers, as you can see, or flax. They can also be made from, oh great, thanks Robin. So Robin's put the CocoNet into the chat if you want to see that. But so these net garlands are, and what I've done there too is I think you can think about what are they called in different cultures. So I've got at the top, it's a ula, a kahoa, a lei, or a salusalu. So they're shared across different Pacific cultures, but across the Pacific cultures, we have these net garlands. They're symbols of welcome. So every time I go back to the Cook Islands, or I've done lots of work in Niue, people will come and meet us and give us kahoa, give us a. But they're also signs of celebration. So graduation, for example, you have lots of lei. It's a sign of mana, so, you know, holding somebody with respect. Mourning, but it's always a bestowal of alofa, which is love and respect. Okay, and I think we can see mathematics in these again. We can see mathematics in the ways that they are made. Actually, I think one of the teachers I was working with yesterday at a school was talking about how she'd noticed kids making these and using mathematics. So in the process of making it, you may be using mathematics, but we can kind of see mathematics in the created object as well. So what about some ideas about where you might see mathematics in these? Who's going to jump in and make a suggestion? Yep, patterns. I can see people talking about patterns. Jillian or Melissa, cool.
Could you talk about weight, like that girl's got actually a lot of them on there? Could you weigh
Yeah, she
them?
does. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, that is a huge number of weight, isn't it? Yeah, and I think you've got a lot of measurement concepts in there, don't you? You know, so you've got your measurement concepts, which see speed. Yep. So that one's a good one from Jackie, is your speed. What else? I think ratio you've got again, and that was what one of the teachers at the school that we were working at for the past couple of days was talking about, that she was watching the kids making them, and they were both using patterns and kind of ratios. So they were doing like candy bars, making ula lole, and they were doing a ratio of like 3 or 4 fruit bursts to every one chocolate bar that they put on. So, you know, you've got kind of your ratios, your fractions, those kinds of things.
There's also an expense element here, financial literacy as well. How much will it cost to make how many? Judging by some of these, Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, so there is that kind of part. And I think that kind of comes into when you're doing a ratio of more expensive chocolate bars to your kind of smaller lollies, that you're thinking about that as well. So, yeah, so your cost, all of those kinds of things all come into it. I'll just show you a problem that we developed from these as well. So this is actually a fraction problem that we did using a Samoan context, and using this idea that when you are using kind of 2 different types of lollies, often you do a fractional amount of it. Okay, so I'm just giving you some time to read that. Okay, and again, you know, we're contextualizing it, talking about how And this is something you would make these for a family reunion, and you want to make them for your relatives. Okay, and so we developed a fraction problem for the children. And what was interesting with this is that your children talked about how having a familiar context like a ulalole was really helpful in solving the problem, because they could really visualize what it looked like. So for them, it was something real that they could connect to, that they could think about. When you make it, this is how you're making it, and I can connect back to it. And that was one of the reflections that the kids talked about. So I think what comes into that, and I probably should have talked about that earlier as well, is that we support our children to engage in high level of mathematics when we give them contexts which are accessible to them. Because if we give them contexts all the time that aren't accessible, then they're having to grapple with the context as well as grapple with the mathematics. So when we think about contexts which the kids can really visualize, which the kids can access straight away, then it gives them a head start into getting into the maths. We've definitely found that with the algebra patterns, where we've done some work and given kids kind of non-contextualized patterns that you'd often see, just blocks and squares and things like that, and then used patterns that the kids are more familiar with from Siapo or from Te Vaiwai, and we found that the children generalized the patterns that they were familiar with at a much higher level, right from kind of word go, than the patterns which were just plain blocks. Okay, so I think that's telling us something about, you know, barriers that we can inadvertently create for children through giving them tasks which are out of the realm of their experience. Okay, so it's not to say that we don't use tasks which are out of the realm of children's experience at different times, but we should also be serving our children by giving them tasks so based on their experiences as well. Okay. And I think you can kind of see through here, I'd just also say it's really important to be launching these tasks, because if you know that you've got kids in your class who have no idea what a ulalole is, then we have to launch it to talk about what it is, to talk about what it looks like, to talk about why it's important, all of those kinds of things, to give everybody access. Okay, let's have a look at another one. So I think another one, you know, is your everyday foods which children eat. So this is just talking about panikeke and making batter, and each one using 2/5 of a cup of batter, and how many cups would you need to make 38 panikeke. I always think when you're using food as a context for problems that you do have to think very carefully about the values that you use. So, you know, the fractional amounts that you use, and make it realistic in terms of how many would you really make. Because I think there's nothing worse than the kind of fake maths that you know, when you have that each panikeke uses, you know, 2.5 cups of batter, when you think it's never going to use that, or you know, and that you're going to make 1,000 panikeke, and yeah. So I think, you know, just be very mindful all the time of thinking about what, you know, what would be a realistic amount that you'd make, what would you really use to make this. Okay, we'll just move on here. So again, I think about the experiences. I've used a couple of experiences here. Yeah, so school events somebody was talking about. So I think there's a place to use school events as a shared context, but what we have to be mindful about is that we're using different contexts all the time in our classroom. So don't use the school context all the time, because like I said at the beginning, the school context is not the children's lives, not genuinely the children's lives. It's somewhere that they come and somewhere they participate, and it's fine to use that in some of our contexts that we're using, but make sure you go beyond just using school. So go to, what do the kids genuinely do outside of school? What are the things that kids genuinely meet outside of school, as well as in using school context, as well as using non-contextual tasks, you know, abstract mathematical tasks as well. It's really about having a blend and using a variety of contexts and a variety of types of tasks. Because I think we can't just use any one, we have to be using a variety. Okay, again, so this is something for you to think about after the session. Think about what are the experiences from the homes or the community of students that you teach. Okay, so it might be that you know that the kids at your school are really into skateboarding, for example. I've seen some really great contextual, and that's your local community. And there might be a skate park that they go to. So you could think about designing problems around the skate park and skateboarding. Or I know another school, the kids are really into BMX bikes and, using BMX bikes. Okay, think about the popular culture. I know we've got teacher from New Plymouth Girls here, and we had some of our researchers who did a little project with the teachers there, focusing on developing tasks for some of the classes there. And I know that our researchers, Rachel and John, interviewed the kids afterwards, and they asked the kids to talk about some of the tasks that they really enjoyed. And there'd been a task that had been designed about the Kardashians. So that was the one that the kids all referred to as being really memorable, and they really liked the task about the Kardashians. So it can be your popular culture is also their experiences, something that kind of makes them connect to mathematics, and something that they kind of, well, hopefully not identify necessarily with the Kardashians, but something that they was kind of, familiar there as well. So let's have a look at your next one here. So your last one that I wanted to focus on is this empowerment. So this idea of how we can use kind of culturally sustaining tasks for empowerment, and this is an idea about social justice. Okay, so you might have actually seen this lesson. This is one that we also wrote for the home learning channel, but this is really talking about migration, and we're talking here to the kids about people from Pacific nations deciding to move to New Zealand and relocating for better jobs, for the reasons of sending money back to home, education, healthcare, but also this idea that many Pacific nations are being affected by climate change and rising sea levels, and people have to leave their homes as their islands are threatened by the changing weather patterns and rising seas. Okay, so we had a look, this was just something that we'd looked into ourselves and thought was quite interesting as a context, and actually did connect really well with the children when we've used this, because a lot of them have family members or have come from families who came through the ballot to migrate to New Zealand. So we've just taken, we looked it up, and we found that people from Tonga, Fiji, Kiribati, Tuvalu could get a New Zealand residence visa through the Pacific Access ballot. And the scheme is a chance-based scheme where people between the ages of 18 and 45 can put their name into the ballot, and the Pacific Access ballot gives the possibility for 1,100 Samoan people, 250 people from Tonga and from Fiji, 70 and 75 from Tuvalu and from Kiribati to come and live in New Zealand. So I think you can look at this already and think about the mathematics that's within this real life situation. And there's genuine mathematics that you can think about here. So what's the time? Yeah, so ideas from people. Yeah, so probability definitely comes up. Anybody else got anything to add to that? Yep. So time series. What, Jackie, did you want to share what you mean about that a little bit? Or oh, from the rising sea levels. Okay, cool. Yeah. Yeah, so thinking about your kind of climate change as well, and yeah, what is going to happen with the rising sea levels. Yep, so you've got your fractions and ratios as well. Yeah, so I'll just show you one of the things that we thought about. I think you can see lots of opportunities in this. We had looked at this in 2019. So in 2019, what we'd found out was that for every 550 people, Tongan people that applied for it, only 22 were successful. And for every 120 people that applied from Kiribati, only 4 were successful. And so we use this as a opportunity for children to think about if you were more likely to be successful in the ballot if you're from Tonga or from Kiribati. And then also just kind of add up this, do you think the ballot numbers should be changed to increase the chances for Pacific people affected by climate change to be successful in the ballot and come and live in New Zealand? You know, so it's kind of one of those social justice questions that we can use, and we can start thinking about addressing in our mathematics classrooms. Okay. I do want to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end, so I'm just going to keep moving through. Okay, and this is actually another task that we've used where we've taken statistics that we found, I've put the link in there as well for you. So there's a number of sites that we can have a look at and find real life information, real life scenarios from statistics in New Zealand about what I think are probable social justice situations. So this is looking at the average hourly pay related to ethnicity and related to gender as well. Okay, and you may have other ideas about what you can do with it. We wanted to get the kids to look at it in terms of statistics, but also in terms of social justice, to think about what is going on here, what questions can you ask. So actually what we set the kids up with this was, we said to get them to talk, you know, to interpret what information does it tell us, but then we asked them, I've put here what statements. We ended up putting it as I wonder. Okay, so and that actually helped the children frame it really well in making their statements. So we asked them to make statements starting with I wonder in regards to the average hourly wages in New Zealand. And it led to, I think, you have to, like I said, I think you have to be brave to use something like this in your classroom, because it led to a lot of quite critical discussion about whether New Zealand is a fair and equitable society. Yeah, I see, I think, I wonder. Yeah, so those are nice starters to use to look at kind of information like this. And the conversations did lead to quite in-depth critical ideas. These were mainly Pacifica students, and it did really lead them to become quite critical about economic situation in New Zealand for their families. And it was kind of interesting to see how they interpreted this, because we had statements, you know, such as, oh, maybe people don't work as hard, then my family works hard, and all of those kinds of things. Yeah, so brought out viewpoints, but using kind of the data as well. That's another example there. Okay, and oops, I think just to finish off, what I wanted to talk about is, how do you build your own knowledge of the use of mathematics at home? Okay, and so I've just got a couple of ideas that I wanted to share with you before you finish off. So I have got this photographs, and I'd like to talk about what I mean by that. So we've been doing a lot of work, and I've got a research project, quite a big research, 2 research projects actually at the moment. So we've been asking children and you know, young adults, I suppose, up into high schools, to take photographs of activities or in the community, in their home, outside of school settings, which they think have mathematics embedded in them. Okay, and not homework activities and not your kind of maths activities, but everyday things that they do that they think involve mathematics, and then come and share them with us. Okay, and I know I've had some teachers who have been successfully doing this, because I think we've got a lot of mobile phones now, and mobile phones have the capacity to, you know, take photographs very easily. So it's a resource now that we can use, and then giving the kids the space to talk about what photographs they have, it gives you a really good resource to start building up your own knowledge. And actually quite surprising, it was quite surprising, and it also has kind of positioned the kids to start seeing where maths is outside of school and how maths is useful. So I think the photographs are really helpful. I know a number of you are in secondary settings, so parent meetings maybe are more or less helpful, I don't know, but we also talk about, you know, talking to parents rather than taking the position of, I'm going to tell you what you need to do with your kids, you know, taking the position of, what are you already doing? You know, what do you already do outside of school that involves mathematics, and how we can build on that? Okay, and then student journals is another way of doing it. So I'd worked with some secondary schools where they were getting kids to, as part of their maths homework, to keep journals about where they encountered maths outside of school, and use that as a resource. Okay, and again, you know, I think it's helpful for you to start thinking about the home context that you could set your problems in and problematic tasks in. Okay, but I think we're 2 minutes to go, so if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I had my email on the front, so always happy for people to email me too. Cool, otherwise I'll hand it back over to you, Gillian, shall I? Cool. I'll just stop sharing now.